fun.
This is going to be a lot of fun. You know, I grew up in Queens, which some of you might know. I grew up in Flushing, New York, and you know, as a kid, I grew up thinking about the internet, and you know, I'm like getting a chance to meet John, who basically built the internet. So I'm super excited today. For some of you, I'd be surprised if some of you didn't know, or if all of you didn't know who John Chambers is, but I should go ahead and give you some background. John is the former CEO of Cisco. He joined Cisco in 1991, and at that time, Cisco's revenues were 70 million. He stepped down as CEO in 2015, and at the time, the revenues were 47 billion, okay? When he joined, there were 400 employees, and at the time he left, the number, I have it written here somewhere. I'll have to
75,000.
75,000.
We got each other's back.
Yes,
we work on boards together.
And the market cap, as I mentioned, is close to 250 billion today. And now, John is the founder and CEO of JC2 Ventures. He's investing in a wide range of super disruptive startups. And I think the most exciting part is he's mentoring many CEOs on how to navigate the journey, and he's giving back to this community. And recently, he's written a book called Connecting the Dots, Lessons for Leadership in a Startup World. We have copies for all of you today. I have read this book. It's an excellent book. It's a great read. I highly encourage all of you to read it. So John, thrilled to have you here. Let's get into it.
Neeraj, it'll be fun.
Okay, you've had a remarkable career, remarkable business career, 180 acquisitions, huge job creation, built an iconic company. But today, I'd like to really talk about things that, you know, you could kind of share lessons learned with a group here on things that they could do better as they build their companies. So maybe we'll start first with, over the last 25 years at Cisco, if there was one thing you could do differently, what would that be during your tenure?
Well, I think one of the most important parts for all is to remember is we tend to like to talk about our successes, but it's how you handle your setbacks and your failures to determine who you are and who you are as a company. You will never have a great company until you have a near-death experience. Jack Welch taught me that. I didn't understand it to 2001. And believe me, when you go from the most valuable company in the world and the CEO that everybody thought might be one of the top CEOs ever to, should I even have a job, that is very humbling. And how you handle that really determines the future of your company and you as a leader. So I was very fortunate that I was prepared for the issues. I wish I'd been smart enough to see it coming. I became too dependent upon my numbers. This is important. Numbers are very good on predicting what's going to happen, except during unusual ups or downs. So first week of December, 70% growth, order-wise. We reconfirmed our guidance for 35% growth in the next quarter. Middle of January, minus 30% growth. 25% of my customers disappeared, didn't stop ordering, gone over the next 2 quarters. And during that time, it was the most stressful time I've ever been through in my life. I thought I'd never have to lay off people again. We laid off 5,700 people, treated everybody very fair, but it didn't matter. You know, it was just something I thought I could avoid. And we came out of it dramatically stronger. My market cap went from the highest in the world to below 100, and then it's come back reasonably good. My peers' market cap went from 1.2 trillion to way below mine. So versus our peers, we executed well, but to a shareholder, it doesn't matter. So I wish I'd been able to anticipate that occurring. And the key takeaway is, in 2007, my data said everything was fine, except 8 of my top financial institutions in the U.S. slowed their ordering all at the same time. And I called up the CEOs and I said, something's going on. And they said, no, we're just kind of being cautious. Well, I knew what cautious meant. And so in August, when we announced our quarter, again, another record quarter, way over expectations, and guidance for next quarter was good, I said, there's something wrong in the market. And I've seen this movie before. And while everybody's saying it's good, when the financial institutions do this, I think we have a problem coming our way. And as any good deed never goes unpunished, I got clobbered in the press. Stock went down, but sure enough, by the middle of 2008, we were in the greatest recession of our time. Now, different than 2001, since I saw it coming, we were prepared. And at that time, we extended credit to the automotive companies when no other high-tech company would. We were aggressive on our acquisitions, and we gained share with tremendous speed. So it's how you handle your setbacks determine who you are. It's more fun to talk about the successes. But Jack Welch called me up at the end of 2001, and he said, John, I just want to tell you, you now have a great company, you're a great leader. And I said, Jack, you're probably going to be the only person in the world who tells me that. And he was. But for you in the room, it's when you hit those tremendously demoralizing challenges that determines your leadership. And if you don't question yourself, then you're not being honest. And the classic approach always applies. How much was self-inflicted? How much was market? Was your strategy working before, or was the issue with the strategy? How long will it take you to come out of it? It will usually take longer, and you'll have to react deeper than you think. And you immediately position, and don't hide, be very transparent. How much self-inflicted, and say, here's what we could do better. How much was market? I felt it was market, largely. And I positioned what would look like 2 years out, and then we got everybody focused on it, shareholders, employees, customers, and partners.
That's amazing, John. Well, it's an interesting comment, especially given current multiples. We live in a frothy environment.
Yes.
Many of the CEOs in the room have built their companies in the last 10 years when multiples have only gone up. Any advice for the folks in the room, how they should be thinking about economic cycles? Obviously, none of us can predict this, but
Sure.
Any words of wisdom there?
Well, it is a hard time to predict because there's probably never been more uncertainties on a global basis. And I talked to almost all the large companies around the world and the leaders around the world, and nobody really knows for sure. I think the key issue is you've got to be flexible. And I used to consider the word agility a nice marketing term, but I wouldn't use it. You do have to be agile. And so I think you have to be prepared. I always look at market transitions, good or bad, technology-driven or economic-driven, as tremendous opportunities. So I'm one that when I see a transition occurring, like 2008, we saw it coming, I use that big time to gain market share. Or when you have new technologies that are coming in that change business models, that's when you move very aggressively, and probably artificial intelligence will overexceed its hype, where most new technologies don't even come close in terms of the capability. I do think you've got to be careful because the companies who focused purely on growth in the 90s, and remember at that time we were taking 500 to 750 companies public per year. Everybody's excited about doing 330 this year. Just to put it in perspective, is if you didn't watch your cash flow and the implications and didn't understand profit implications, if you get caught in a downturn, it is brutal. And I think my advice would be very careful on how you navigate this. And if you're taking the risk, just be transparent to your investors and transparent to the market. Because as long as you tell people the risk they're taking, then they invest knowing that.
That's great. All right, well, let's kind of switch gears and talk a little bit about hiring.
Okay.
You know a lot about hiring, having built a company of 70,000 people.
Yes.
I've heard you say this a few times at board meetings, just concept of always be recruiting. Can you talk about your perspective on recruiting, time allocation to it? Any nuggets you'd share?
Well, I've always believed that you should be recruiting all the time. I'll fly on an airplane and somebody will ask me questions and I'll log away what I thought of that person, et cetera. And then one recent example, I hired her 20 years later when she saw I was getting a startup going, et cetera. I believe that next to your vision and strategy, the quality of your team you build determines your future or not. And unfortunately, while we'd all like to say it's about leader and then you get B players around you, you can be an A company, you can't. So I think it's about getting the best and the brightest who fit into your culture. One of the lessons learned, only recruit people in your culture. My mistakes made is that I could look at a world-class talent. They could have great expertise in an area such as fast Ethernet or machine learning, and they might not fit in my culture. And I thought I could modify their behavior. And I could for a while until things got stressful. And so I'm a huge believer. Determine what your culture is. Don't kid yourself what it is. A culture at an Uber is different than a Microsoft, is different than an Oracle and a Cisco. Recruit to that culture and match it. At Cisco, my attrition ran 5% voluntary over 20 years, and the Valley runs 15. Out of acquired companies, and I acquired 180 of them, I was acquiring people in next generation products. So it was about, did you keep the people? My attrition rate on acquired companies was 4%. Unheard of. But it's recruiting companies that matched our culture as well. So culture ended up being a very important part of recruiting. And then what questions do you ask during the recruiting cycle? First, if anybody's dumb enough to give you a reference that isn't going to check out, you've got a bigger problem. So you always want to back channel people. And I will usually, during the interview, deliberately put people under stress, see who it is that we know in common, and then ask them, do you mind if I call them very confidentially on the balance overall? And I always ask the classic questions of what are your biggest successes, but what are your biggest mistakes, and what would you do differently? And then I always test to see if they match the culture. Are they really customer-driven? Do they really care about people? Do they share the success with their employee team, or do they keep it at the top?
Can you share any nuggets on maybe one or two hiring mistakes you made? What went wrong there? What you would do differently? Any nuggets on that?
Yeah, they would both be in areas where I recruited somebody who I knew had a different culture. And it's like if you're a basketball fan getting a 7-foot center that can really dribble and shoot and everything, but they just couldn't fit into the Warrior style of basketball. And so you've got to recruit to your culture. And so every time that I made a mistake on recruiting is when I recruited somebody wrong culturally, or I didn't back channel references. Back channeling is so important, and building that trust, and then never betray the trust when somebody gives you feedback, good or bad, to the people.
And stylistically, you mentioned something about adding a little stress to the interview setting.
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk about that? What do you do there?
No mistake about it. Whether I'm coaching the young CEOs or their leadership team, and I do that probably, well, you know what it's like. I do it probably 15, 20 times a week with members of the team. I always put them under a little bit of stress. I tell them I'm going to do that on the front end. I'm going to say I'm going to have more fun with this than you will, but I want them to know that I'm going to push them, and I'm going to tell them during this interview, and I want to be careful not to be rude, but the minute you are on a roll with an answer, I've learned everything I'm going to learn. So I'm going to tell them, when you get on a roll, I'm going to stop that question, I'll go on to the next one, and I'll watch how they handle the disruption. And then when I get them under a little bit of pressure, especially if I ask mistakes made, et cetera, and I see them start to sweat a little bit, I push them a little bit further. And I get them used to that type of candor and trust. And don't misunderstand, I form friendships for life. I mean, I really get close to my leadership team, and especially the young CEOs and team that I coach. But I teach them how to handle that pressure, and it starts with the interview.
That's great. That's great. Can you just talk a little bit about hiring, given the kind of the millennial generation? Kind of what's changing in your mind? And
changing with tremendous speed. I saw the numbers the other day in the Valley, and New York's very close behind it. The average employee in the Valley has only been with their company 2 3/4 years, and it's decreasing. And we used to talk about the younger generation going to have 5 jobs in their career. Shoot, my son had 5 jobs before he was 40. And this gig economy has a lot of positives. I don't think people have been through the negatives on a downturn and the implications associated with it. But and it is both how long a person stays at a company, and even with hot startups, we're starting to see people do it like a VC, is they get 2 years in the hot startup, take their options, invest for 2 years, go to the next one, and they begin to do a portfolio play. And then I think we're not too far away to where a large percentage of employees won't even be employees. It will be core versus context, temporary workforce. That's tough. Now, I've made a deliberate decision for the companies I'm coaching that I think being an exception to that is key, and realize you will be an exception. And it means you might only be recruiting from 25 to 30% of the market if you're trying to get people who truly want to be with you for 5 or 10 years. Don't ask them for life, because they don't even think that far ahead. But when you're recruiting cycle, ask them what have they done before, what's important to them, how important is it making a difference, their views about developing value to last, how they think about customers, their peers. And so part of the culture that I'm encouraging my CEOs that I'm coaching to build is to have a company where your turnover will be sub 10% voluntary per year. That will be the exception. And you need to realize, by definition, you can't all be exceptions. Understand what you are and understand what you're not. Oracle clearly understands who they are and what they're not. Cisco does the same way, and that's what I coach my young CEOs. Obviously, I only acquired companies at Cisco. They said, how did you get them to adjust to your culture? I didn't. If they didn't have a similar culture, I didn't touch them, no matter how good the financial decision was. If I couldn't keep the top executives, I wouldn't acquire them. Same thing with the startups I select to coach and mentor, and the VCs I partner with, Neeraj, which you've been a great partner on. It's about that mutual values and trust.
It is amazing to see John operate with this attrition rate in mind. Like he's pushing companies to get to 5% attrition rate, and have that influence your culture. So it's I think it's really important metric there.
You alluded to something earlier, and I thought about one more thought on it. Very often, it's so important to know what your differentiation is, both what it is today and what it'll be 3 to 5 years out, and what are your peers going to do in the market. And I always believe your real competitors will be other startups and come at you from below. It won't be the big incumbents who move too slow. The second thing is you all will be different than the startups of a decade ago. The large companies, if you were to ask me, can you partner with a large company 5 to 10 years ago, I would say I strongly suggest not. Because for a large company, if you're going to partner and you really have a partnership, you've got to be able to be material to their top and bottom line. And so a large company will love you too much or kill you and ignore you. That has changed. And the reason for change is probably threefold. First is the large companies are really struggling to innovate very fast. Secondly, they are not getting the talent. If you were to talk about AI being the next transition, which I believe it will be, the large enterprise customers aren't getting anywhere near the top 10% of the AI talent, whether it's the PhDs, the masters, et cetera, on it. And it's probably 3 or 4 major high-tech companies that are, and probably 5 startups that are. And so you're seeing both the need to innovate in a market where the large companies are not rewarded for making decisions 3 to 5 years out. Shareholder activists, regulation, huge pressure on the CEO, which means more short-term thinking by shareholders and others. And so they're often not taking the risk as far out as they would before. And also the small companies move with a speed and almost a fearlessness, but have learned to develop these relationships. So with the large enterprise companies, I'm now seeing companies form strategic partnerships that would never been done before. As an example, a company here in New York, which you've never heard of, called ASAP, it is still in stealth mode. By the way, their average order is $15 million, first time order. Artificial intelligence, wonderful CEO, and I'm pushing him very hard to become more public and lead the AI transition. So today's another gentle nudge because I know he'll hear about it. But he went from a million a year to 60 million a year to way over 180 million a year this year. And that's in stealth mode. But what the companies are looking for him to do is to partner with them. Or Spark Cognition out of Texas, 220 people partnering with Boeing to design the next FAA architecture for the U.S., where Boeing puts in the money, Spark Cognition puts in the AI talent and the ability to work together. I'm seeing that become a common theme. It's hard to do, and you want to be careful how you do it, but it's an opportunity that candidly the group that went in front of you did not have.
That's great. Let's talk about just executive team building. One of the stats in your book, which I found interesting here, and I just want to read this. You mentioned you had 7 CFOs, 8 heads of sales, 6 heads of engineering, 6 VPs of BD during your time at Cisco. But from the outside, the company never seemed like there was chaos in these transitions. How did you make this happen? Because the founders in this room, as they're scaling, the biggest challenge we see is they got to keep thinking about, is the person the right person for the job now? And you pulled this off at Cisco. Talk about that.
Well, one of the mistakes that I made is I didn't anticipate how long we could grow at over 65% growth per year, and what that means, you're doubling headcount every 18 months. And so when you're growing that fast, it's hard for you to grow your team with the speed that you need. And I came up with a rough rule of guidance of a third of the leaders from internal promotion, a third through acquisitions, and a third through outside recruitment. That makes sense if you're growing really rapidly. If you're only growing 20 or 30%, you want a much heavier lift from internal for the career matching on it. The second thing is I'd watched at Wang and IBM, and the advantage to be with both those companies, they were on top of their industries, and they became too inbred, and they left people in the same jobs too long. And while my average duration of my senior leadership team time with Cisco when I left was between 15 and 25 years, very few of them had been in the same job for more than 4 to 5 years. And so I deliberately would rotate people every 4 to 5 years, and if I didn't, they got stagnant. And I knew that when you were scaling at this, the CFO who brought me through the early stages, Larry Carter, probably was not the one to take me to the next stages. And I realized that as you make this transition, you wanted to be seamless, and we did to the market and otherwise, and they were. There are some of the things the market didn't see because of our growth where we messed up. We didn't mess up on the transitions with the leadership.
But you were able to maintain this sense of loyalty with these executives
Oh, yeah.
while you were sometimes transitioning them out and transitioning
Yes.
them in the business
Well,
somewhere
you
else?
just treat
How do you
people
manage
like you
that?
wanted to be treated yourself, and you don't surprise them. I give constant feedback. You've watched me with Raji,
Yeah.
and tough love is my philosophy. We are a family. I take my leadership team fishing to Alaska or a place like that for 20 years, and at my expense. And I now take 12 of the startup CEOs and 12 experienced leaders to train them. So I build the very tight relationships, and it's an understanding that while we're a family, we are a high-performance family. And understanding that culture and where it fits in is key. We're not a Netflix. We're not a professional team that you either get up or out. And by the way, they have a wonderful culture. It's different than Cisco. And you've got to reinforce it. And so during my 20 years as CEO, I might have lost 5 people out of my top 100 or 2. And remember, those rotate over the time period in total that I didn't want to lose. So it was a very, I think, careful and evolution. The mistakes that you all make as startups, and I'm going to ask how many of you have already done it, is you're going to get a team that you're going to be so loyal to. And you're like me. You fall in love with the team. The people are busting their tails. They're working 60 hours a week for you. And then you know they're not going to be able to scale. And because of that loyalty, what are you going to do? You're going to keep them too long. And if you moved them to another role, your head of engineering moved them to chief strategist, or your head of sales moved them to channels, you would have been able to keep them. But when you wait too long, then you've got to change them. And at first, it's their problem. But then when you don't change them, it is your problem. And that's a mistake each of you will make. How many of you have already made that?
Okay, that's pretty much everyone. Yeah. Well, actually, speaking of which, let's we're on the board of Sprinkler. Raji was here, I think earlier. He gave me the permission to ask this question.
Okay.
And just background, Sprinkler is about a 1,500 person company today.
Yeah.
What mistakes did Raji make, and what guidance did you give him?
Well, first, let's talk about his positives, and that's how you always talk when you deal with the situation. You focus on the positives, here's the areas to improve, and then here's how we work together on both. And if you can't give 3 areas for somebody to improve, you're not being transparent to them. So even in the board meetings, I always ask the team, here are your 3 positives that are working in sales, here are the 3 negatives, here's what it's working in human resources, et cetera. So on the positives, there's no substitute for somebody being wicked smart, and he is. And he clearly understands not social media, he clearly understands communications at a whole different level. He has the potential to be the #1 player in this industry. And I'm way beyond social media. I'm talking about the customer experience, the front office. We'll see if he can get there or not. And he has the raw talent to outline a strategy and vision for it. But he hit the classic mistakes. He did pretty well at 100 people. But at 500, he stumbled. And at 1,500, he really stumbled in terms of his evolution of his team. And that's where the breakage happens. It happens at 100, 500, 1,500, and then it goes all the way to 5,000. There's nothing magical about these numbers, but give or take 10%, that's when you as a leader has to change. That's when your leadership team has to evolve. You could do the same thing off of revenues. And obviously, by definition, the quicker you go there, the more challenging it is. And be careful. Growth will cover up your mistakes, which come back to bite you. And so I think part of it was he didn't evolve his leadership team quick enough. And you've been a huge part of this in a very, very positive way, Neeraj. And that in the last year, we now have 5 of the top 8 are new players. And it's because the group before couldn't take him to the next level, and they stayed too long. And he did the classic mistake. How many of you are engineering background?
About half.
How have you done on the hiring of sales? Your sales lead. Have you done a pretty good job?
He's cold calling you now.
Yeah.
There we go.
It's all online sales.
Yeah. Every one of you who are engineers will mess up your sales leader, because you're going to pick a sales leader who's a business development person who talks like an engineer, and they will fail. And so you've got to realize that when you're really smart in one area, do not assume it goes over to the other. The same thing with sales leadership. They will mess up when they recruit the engineering lead, because they'll pick somebody who talks really intelligently about customers and talks to technology, and that's very often not what you want for the engineering lead. So know what you know what you don't, and then get people around you who complement you. Now, to Raji's tremendous credit, he's made this transition. We're back on a really good growth number. We have a chance to lead through this industry, but he's been through 2 near-death experiences. And he got people around him, and I'm honored. I'm more his coach and his confidant than I am a board member or an investor. And the board knows that's exactly what I do and where I spend my time with him. But he did exactly what we talked about. And I think he will build a great company.
Yeah, it's great. You know, what I'll say in that experience.
What would you add to it?
What I would add is, having been the first investor, it's the comment you made about growth covers up issues, and there's always issues in a business, but surprisingly, when a business is doing really well, I would say founder CEOs are unaware of those issues and are not as focused on it.
Or they postpone it.
In his case, was building the infrastructure that he basically single-handedly built a business to 100 million on his back.
Yes, he did.
He's an incredible founder. Most founders would have broken at 20.
Yep.
And so then we had to build a team, and it cost us a couple of years, but now we're back on a good growth trajectory. Let's get tactical for a moment.
Okay.
I have seen you walk around with this binder and be incredibly prepared, even at this stage.
Yes.
Talk about your day. How do you spend your time? What's your thinking on EAs? Just give some guidance here.
Sure. So one of the important things is, as a young CEO and a young sales leader before that, I felt that process was bureaucracy, and I didn't like either. And I was really wrong. What allows you to move with tremendous speed is a replicatable innovation process. And so when I go into meetings, I'm the best prepared in every meeting, almost without exception. I can literally correct the President of the United States about who's sitting at his table and what's their background and which state they were from. I do it gently, of course. A little bit of humor, you'll get used to that over time. And so I have a booklet. McKinsey is setting up. I apologize.
Oh.
I messed with this a little bit too much. McKinsey's with me. She is my head of communications out of a PR agency, Rudder Finn, who's amazing. But together, we put together a booklet with Shannon that's about an inch thick for each day. And I have everything in it memorized. So when I meet with the CNBC later today, I not only know the three announcers who I've known well, I know exactly what's going on in the market, where Beyond Meats is in their announcement today, how I'm going to compare Lyft, Uber versus Zoom and Pinterest and others. So I go into the meetings very well prepared. And once you get the process down, then I don't do 3 meetings a day. I can do 15. And it's the ability to really do that well. You had asked about an executive assistant. When I came out of the East Coast, out of IBM and then Wang, I went out to the West Coast and I looked for an EA, and they kept giving me senior secretaries. And I actually interviewed 22 people before I found my EA, Debbie. And she adds probably 40% to my day when I was CEO. So
Wait, say that all these people are time-starved. 40% incremental productivity.
per day.
Okay.
Per day. But she's not a senior secretary. She's not there to go get me coffee or answer the phone. She's there to help me be dramatically more effective. She's got her finger on the pulse, what's going on, when are people coming by the office 3 times more often than normal. Give me feedback without her violating confidence that perhaps what I said in the company meeting probably wasn't as effective as it needed to be. Helps me prioritize the time. I get on a plane to go for a week's trip. I've given her no guidance on what to do on that week's trip, and everything is laid out for me. So process with an innovation playbook allows you to move with speed, and you can say, John, I kind of get it, but does that apply to everything? It does. In how I acquired companies, there were 5 basic plays we ran. We didn't change it. I could get a call from the NASDAQ on a Thursday night from the CEO and said, John, you're an idiot. And I said, I know that, but what did I do now? And he said, it's public knowledge now, but you've got 2 of your top competitors in a company that you should own, and it's perfect for you, and you're not even there. And I said, okay, what's the name of the company? And he told me the name of the company. I had no idea who they were. So I was a little bit embarrassed. And I called up my business development lead and then called up the CEO of that company that night. I had my business development lead there at 8:30 in the morning. He called me at 9:30 and said, John, get over here. At noon, we had a handshake on a $3.2 billion acquisition through both boards by the end of the weekend, announced Monday morning. And by the way, it went great. But it's because we have a replicatable playbook which moves with speed. And out of 180 acquisitions, probably 2/3 hit or exceeded our expectations. And our attrition rate was 4% out of the acquired companies. A market where 90% of the acquired companies fail, if you consider, did the acquirer really get the financial benefit for their shareholders? And the attrition rate runs 20%.
And talk about acquisitions. A lot of the founders here are going to acquire small companies along the way until they get public and then acquire bigger ones. As they're acquiring, what should they be thinking about? 1 or 2 nuggets there from 180 acquisitions?
First thing, it's a high probability it will fail. And don't kid yourself. And don't think you're going to be smarter or work harder. Everybody works smarter and harder. You want to say, how strategic is this to you? And you acquire bigger to smaller. Mergers among acquisitions, especially if you split up the leadership team, the boards 50-50, always fail. My dream was always to have a Synoptics and a Wellfleet combined. You may not know those names, but they were my toughest switch competitor, my toughest router competitor, and they took each other down. Even better was Lucent and Alcatel combining. Two companies in trouble, equal companies, killed themselves. So understand going in, it's going to be hard. Secondly, the only two things are non-negotiable when I acquired a company: whose culture would survive and whose systems would survive, because I had to have that replication on it. And I would learn from it. And I focused, could I hold not just the founder, could I hold the top 4 or 5 people, especially the emotional leader, spiritual leader of the company. And I literally would get them signed, and I'd rather have a handshake than a signature, but signed to staying with me for 2 years, and I usually held them 10 in terms of the commitment on it. I would also immediately go, how many of you are business-to-business software?
So everyone here, yeah, it's all B2B, yep.
Okay, so business-to-business, go to your customers. Your customers will tell you who you should acquire if you're listening well, and they'll tell you who not to acquire. And even if it's a public company, do this subtly behind the scenes. And so there was only one Steve Jobs, and it still took him 7 years. He just knew what to build. What I was very effective at was I would have my customers tell me who to acquire, or when I was thinking about an area, I'd say, here are the 3 companies I'm looking at, which one should I acquire? And if they were public, I had confidence in people I could go to and ask. And so almost without exception, it was the top customers that would say this would fit in to it or not, or a NASDAQ coming to me and say, John, you're an idiot for not moving on this. It will be hard, and you want to think about geographic proximity. The minute you have to get on an airplane, your odds of success get cut in half. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it gets cut in half on it. And then again, just my strong opinion, don't acquire a company with a different culture. And you can tell the culture. It takes me 5 minutes when I talk to a CEO to get the culture. And if he can't finish my sentences on common customers, how he shares success with his employees, what are his values or her values, you can figure that out pretty quickly.
How about the other side? Some of the folks here might want to sell their business one day to Cisco or Microsoft. Any nuggets, any lessons they should be doing with companies?
So first, the exit strategy for somewhere between 50 to 70% of you will be through acquisition. So the first thing you want to do is build a company to last and tell people you're not really interested in being acquired, but you'll always talk. So anybody that wants to sell the company to me, I am really heads up and uncomfortable with. So I think if you really, your exit strategy is most likely acquisition, you want to build a company that lasts, so when the company buys you, they're going to have a structure that really makes sense to them. All the way down to the VCs, I got along so well with the VCs in the Valley and beyond. They would never sell me a lemon, and they would always be very open on what works and doesn't work, because if they did, I'd never buy another one from them. So you want to develop those relationships in terms of the overall approach. And I always look at it from win-win. I got up twice during a negotiation that was done where the other side lied to me, or the other side quit thinking about it as a win-win. And I went over to my team and said, I know we put a lot of work into it, and I know we've got it through the board, but I just think this will be a mistake. And you've got to have the courage to walk. Don't fall in love with the acquisition, that if you find something that is a problem for you, that you don't have the courage to walk if that occurs.
That's great. All right, we're going to open up the questions in a couple of minutes. So I just want to have a couple of fun topics for you. Coming back to global issues, you have chosen to spend a lot of time helping the leaders of France and India.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Why are you doing that? How are you excited about it? To talk about that?
Well, I'm a dreamer. And one of the other questions, if you'd asked me earlier, after 2001, what would I have done differently in another area? I got criticized for dreaming too big, setting too big of stretch goals, trying to do too many things. I think if I had to do over, I would actually dream bigger, put more stretch goals, and done more things. And realize with that, some of the failure rates would be up on it. One of the issues I'm very worried about is that with digitization, artificial intelligence, the automation that's going to occur, we are going to destroy 20 to 40% of the jobs. and almost all industries will be affected. And so different than decades before in the 90s where the internet and the companies, we destroyed some jobs, we created, US as an example, probably 22.5 million jobs and 34% growth in GDP. And last time America had a raise, 24% increase in per household income. This one will be different. And so if large companies aren't going to add any headcount, and in total they will not, probably decrease over the next decade. And the CEOs of large companies would agree with that statement. It said all the job growth is going to come from startups and small companies getting bigger. And you saw that in the 275,000 jobs added last month. 80% of them were from small companies in the private sector. Only 20% were from the big ones. And so I'm looking at how do you create a new generation of startups at probably 3 to 5 times the volumes that are currently now. And we got excited about IPOs at 330. In the 90s, we averaged 400 to 750 per year. And so if you're going to create 25 million jobs in this country over the next decade, and you're going to have to replace 10 to 15 million jobs that will be destroyed more than normal, the startup pickup has to occur, and it has to be across the nation. It can't be New York, Boston, Texas, and Silicon Valley. The disruption when that occurs is a problem. So I looked at digitizing countries, and we worked with the leadership in Israel, Netanyahu and the late Shimon Peres, and we digitized Israel and took it startup to the next generation. But everybody says that's just Israel. So then when I looked in Europe, what was the last country you would invest in? France.
France.
What is the best country to invest in Europe today? France. They went from 140 venture capital-backed startups per year to 748 in 4 years. And government, citizens working together. Now the French are famous for revolution. We'll see if Macron can change this country. But it gives you an idea. What they were looking at is inclusive job growth across the country. I'm doing that with Modi in India. I'm the French high-tech ambassador for Macron, but I'm also the head of the U.S.-India Strategic Partnership Forum and very close to Modi. And he's one of the top 3 leaders I've ever met in my life. If you're betting on one country in Asia, double down on India. If you want to bet on a second country in Asia, quadruple down on India. They will grow probably 7 to 10% for this next decade. Intellectual property protection is good, assuming Modi wins this next election with a reasonable representation on it. So I'm trying to do that across the U.S. as well.
Great, great. All right, we're going to open it up to questions. We have mics around the room. So who's got the first question for John? All right.
Now, it's very important when you get your first question, and I train all the young CEOs, communication in Jack Welch's era didn't need to be good at it at all. Communication in my era was important. In your world, it is a must. When one of your customers has an issue, they don't expect you to respond to it in 24 hours. They expect you to respond to it in 5 minutes, regardless of whether it came through social media or otherwise. Your first question you get with an audience is so important, and your last one. And so you want to go over to the person asking the question. You want to make eye contact before they have a chance to ask the question. Remind them how strategic this is to how this session goes. Put a little bit of pressure on them. Make them want to help you along the way. And your question, sir?
Yeah. John, thank you.
I don't mind if it's not on. If it's not on, I like the question. I'll say it again. If I don't like it, I'll just twist it a little bit.
Yeah, I'd like to hear how you think about education, particularly higher education, and how industry can work to promote the kind of education that we need to foster the startup environment that you're advocating.
Gotcha. Being very candid, I think most of us in this room know the American education system K through 12 is broken. It's non-competitive. Huge problem for our kids, huge problem for our country, et cetera. So I think we have to transform that, and I'd love to see a president who has the courage to work with governors to do it. That's a huge lift. The higher universities, I think, have to change dramatically. And if I were using a model, I would use a model of a Stanford or the IITs out of India. IITs out of India started with startups and incubators 10 years ago. I actually am sponsoring the number third one out of Madras. They've done 185 in the 10 years. They'll do 1,000 in the next 5 years. I'm dreaming about how do you bring startups to the central part of the nation and the southeast. So if I just wanted to make money, I'd stay with you guys and a couple of your VC peers in Silicon Valley. I want to create uniform jobs across the board. So I'm going to take a huge risk and take the France of Europe in West Virginia and say, can we make West Virginia a startup state? And not just with what a Steve Case does, which I think is amazing, but we're going to transform the university curriculum. The president of the Senate is on board, the Speaker of the House is on board, the governor is on board, the Democratic U.S. Senator, Republican U.S. Senator. We're bringing in venture capital. I brought them out to Silicon Valley. Stanford sent their best and brightest, including John Hennessy, who is a very good friend, talked about the transitions that occur, talked about the top entrepreneurial group, put them in touch. We did video into India about how do you do incubation centers, what do you do with Station F out of France, etc. I'm going to put in quite a few $1 million purely give back into a startup venture fund that will be run out of the university. We're going to change the university curriculum. We're going to take it out of silos. We're going to make it a startup university. We're going to require probably entrepreneurial training for everyone, whether you're going into liberal arts, whether you're going into medicine, whether you're going into high tech. We're going to force engineering, the med school, et cetera, to work together. Will we ever be a Stanford? No, but we can be a job creator in West Virginia with a long-term attitude on it. And so I believe that's what's going to happen to our higher ed education. And before you say it's just about great universities, MIT used to be the engine of startups out of Boston. And I was there with Wang Laboratories. By the way, high tech's going in Boston. Biotech's there. But DEC, 106,000 people, Wang, 32,000 people, probably in total support system, 1 million people lost their jobs. MIT owns at least a third of that. They didn't transform the education system. And they started being a startup engine. Out of my first 100 companies I bought, probably 20 of them were tied directly or indirectly to MIT. 48% of them were tied to Stanford. The last 80 I bought, 0. And I talked to the executive chairman at MIT, and he agreed they had to change. Venture capital world had to change as well, et cetera, on it. So trying to bring all that to one state, get a replicatable playbook, and then move over. So it's a nice way of saying, while our universities are the best, they have to change their curriculum dramatically. And if I had a young child going to work in a university and saying what to prepare, I'd do AI, I'd do cybersecurity and entrepreneurism.
All right, next question.
So, John, thank you very much.
Sure. Where are you? Just hold up your hands, I can find you.
You can look directly the other way. So I'm managing our Slido app. There's some incredible questions coming in, so thanks to everyone. One of the questions I wanted to pull out was to ask if you could comment on the role of your board. How did you staff the board over time? What role did it play in your journey?
Oh, yeah. So this is a fun one. Because when I came to Silicon Valley, I didn't know the Valley. I went out to the top companies. Lou Platt at HP spent a huge amount of time with me, the top Intel people, and they did it out of kindness, the culture. Only 400 people, they didn't even know who Cisco was. But I asked them about the boards. And as I got to know them, most of them would say it's a necessary evil. You've got to do that to represent your shareholders, but they aren't that important to me. They worded it nicer than that. And you've got to give them data so you don't surprise them. But most of them did not use their boards very effectively. It took me a while to really learn how to use my board more effectively, but boy, it was a resource for me the last 10 years. You know, and I got the top academics, John Hennessy from Stanford, Christina Johnson, Duke Engineering, always had one top financial person, Dick Kovacevic, for example, out of Wells Fargo. And I used my board, and I understood what they could bring to me and what were the strengths of each one. And while I'd respect each person's view, I knew what their subject matter expertise was. And I actually built as strong a culture on the board as I did in the company. And Neeraj and I believe in that philosophy together. So for a startup now, I think a board is one of the best resources you can have. And you want a diverse board, both in terms of gender, people of color, and age. But you want a board that really can be your go-to on certain topics, a candid group, and I'd encourage you to have a board that challenges you. Now, make no mistake about it, as a CEO, you want a board that you can trust. Doesn't mean they always want to agree with you, and it doesn't mean they shouldn't change at a point in time, but you want to select a board that you can trust and match culture. So don't put somebody on the board that you feel you can't trust or doesn't match on culture in terms of the direction.
John, we're over here.
Okay.
Hi, John. Elisa Steele.
Hey, Lisa.
We
The other
were
one to watch is when somebody's in the back of the room. They're often the most difficult question you're going to get. So you walk over, you get close to them, get close
It's a
enough. They're
layup.
gonna,
It's
they're
a
gonna,
layup.
Again, listen. Yes.
Good to see you.
It's a pleasure. How you doing?
We were at a dinner together a handful of years ago, and at the time I was a C-level executive at a humongous company.
Yes.
And one of the people at the dinner asked you, John, you must only have, 3 priorities for what you do. And you laughed and you said, are you kidding me? I'm the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company that's on a rebound. I have at least 43 priorities.
Yeah.
And if you don't have 43 priorities, you're not doing the right things. And I had such an amazing sense of relief because I was running this huge organization. I had 53 priorities.
Yes.
And I finally felt validated that it was okay.
Okay.
So this is a room full of CEOs who are running much, much smaller companies, including myself. I'm the CEO of a cloud company here in New York.
Yeah.
Would your advice change, or does the list just never get shorter?
No, the advice would change, and I needed to qualify a second part. At that time, I was running Cisco with a number of different businesses, 18 different, and we were 1 or 2 in 16 of them, usually with over 40% market share, and number 3 in the other. And so I ran them a little bit as independent groups that had to work loosely together. So in terms of my priorities, I had 5 to 7 top priorities, and then the other 40-some were elements within each of those top priorities. So I would encourage you to have, if you have more than 10 priorities, you've got too many. I'd say, what are your core 3 to 7? And then underneath those, what are the priorities that either you develop or your teams develop on it? So again, I would qualify that. Yeah.
All right, John, one other question from online. During periods of transition, how do you balance being transparent with your team and creating urgency while also balancing the desire to stay positive and keep people motivated?
I think candor and transparency is a must. First, with the way information flows today and all the social media issues, people are going to know anyhow. So I think the most important thing you do is to be very transparent, even on very painful situations. And people would trust you if you say, here's where we are. You've got to be candid. How much of it, as I alluded to earlier, during crisis or otherwise. Here's what's self-inflicted. Here's what's not. Here's what we're going to do differently, et cetera. So for me, trust is everything. I do my acquisitions on a handshake. It's really hard on my legal team. But I'd much rather have your word than I would a contract. I'm a lawyer. I know how to break contracts. And the point that I'm making, trust is everything. Your currency today is your track record, your relationships, and your trust. And those are the 3 for your company and for you. And you never want to lose it. So I think transparency becomes key. There's a question, right? Yes.
Hey, John, I'm going to stand up.
Okay.
I'm going to look you in the eyes.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask
now
my
this
question.
is reverse role. So this one could be really tough. So as I'm walking over, anticipating what the question could be, I'm looking to see his background a little bit, see if we have mutual interest on anything, if he likes sports, outdoors, hunter. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not a sports guy, sadly.
Okay.
I'm not a hunter. But I do have a question. I'm reading a mind-bending book called Brave New Work, which has me questioning a lot of what I believe to be true around process. And this book talks about the difference between complicated systems and complex systems. So an engine is complicated. You can figure it out. A watch is complicated. But a startup is complex. It's like the weather or it's like traffic. And the example this book makes is that usually we try to control things like with traffic lights. But if you put in a roundabout, you actually reduce injuries by 75%. So instead of trying to control things, you should create environments that allow for people to just naturally act in better ways. And so the example they give is if travel expenses are too high, instead of instituting policies, you should introduce transparency into spend so everybody can see what everyone else is spending. So it's the roundabout versus the traffic light. Okay. And it's a very kind of anti-process book, a very sort of Netflix-like approach. Yeah. And so it sounds like maybe you figured it out a bit more around leveraging process, or I'm wondering in a startup, should it be more like a roundabout versus a traffic light? I'd love to just hear more about that.
The answer is that this is hard to get used to as a leader. Multiple styles work. You've got to own your company strategy and vision You've got to own responsibility for develop, recruiting the leader. You've got to own the culture, which becomes very key, and you've got to own the communications. Both a roundabout and cross sections work. By the way, there aren't too many roundabouts in the world, and there's a reason that there aren't. So it is not a solution to it. You've got to decide on your own leadership style. I am a believer in empowerment, but make no mistake about it, I can get down in the details very quickly. I don't micromanage, but if I get down in the details, find out one of my leaders not doing what I expect, I am tough. I ask, all right, what are you going to do differently? What are you going to get back? You're going to report back. If I see that they don't know what to do, I help them as a coach get through it, etc. So I'm a believer, especially with a startup, you need to know what's going on in your key operations. You don't micromanage on it. You have to realize what your style is. And part of it is dependent upon how experienced your team is around you. Because if you're a pretty experienced leader, how many of you are on your third startup or more? Okay,
Wow.
You know where I'm going with this. If you're on your third startup or more and you're hiring a bunch of young leaders who are on their first startup, you're going to have to coach them more than normal. So it's like the number of direct reports. It's the same concept. If you have an experienced team who's worked with you for a while, your direct reports can be 10, 15. If it's the first time for you and it's the first time for many of the leaders, first time in the company, and they're new within a year or two, probably you're down at the 5 to 7 range on it. I would probably err for innovation process, and notice the use of the word. It's how do you get a culture and a process that works well. And Netflix, I think, is actually a good model. They are remarkably structured on how they do things and remarkably candid. But they are a professional team, but they all know their roles and they challenge each other on it in terms of the approach. So I have to think about it. It's the first time I've heard it put that way, but I would probably say I'd be in between the two.
So, John, I think we have time for one more.
No pressure. The person
No
there in the
pressure.
middle.
Last question.
The last question. This is how we feel when we leave the room, and people say, "Oh, that was really the best session," or "Neeraj, you and John didn't do quite as good a job." You want to end on a high, but if it's a wimpy question, your peers will give you a hard time.
That's good. Challenge accepted. So I wanted to ask you about remote workforce. You had a couple of comments here about sort of co-located, walking by the office. You know, the world has kind of changed. There's talent shortage.
Yeah.
How do you feel about distributed teams, and also at different stages, like not at a Cisco level where you bought companies all over the world, but at a 2, 3, 500 person company?
Yeah. This is one that while we built the technology to allow your employees to be located anywhere in the world, anytime, I actually believe in key office centers. It allows you to get your culture better. When you acquire a company, it allows you to bring them into that culture and centers. It allows you to see when people have problems or not. That doesn't mean they can't work from home 50% of the time, but I want to have central sites. And I often, even down to the level of acquiring, wouldn't acquire one in a remote location where I had no culture or presence, because sometimes acquisitions work or sometimes not. If they don't work, you got two choices. You either fold them into what you're currently doing. If there's nothing else there to fold them into, you have to lay them off. And so I'm a believer in the two, and that view changed over time. It's why we had 2 headquarters, one in India and one in Silicon Valley. It was about talent attraction. And I think one of the dangers you can run as a startup is to say that you can run your operations in not just 4 or 5 different places across the U.S., but you can have accounting down in Argentina, and you can have engineering over in Eastern Europe, and you can have your sales leader and your finance leader wherever you want. I'd be very careful on that. I actually like structure. I like being global in terms of the experience, but I would have more, based on your size, more centers as opposed to just completely workforce wherever you can find them. How many of you would agree with that? How many of you disagree? And that's one of the mistakes that I think people make. It's always good when you start, but you track that person whose location is up in the Rocky Mountains, and the first 3 years things go well. And then in year 5, 6, and 7, you watch where their emails, what time they come in at. They quit coming in at 11 o'clock at night and 7 in the morning. They come in at 2 to 4 in the afternoon. That's it. And so managing people remotely, especially with a young, rapidly growing team, is hard. And your span of control has to drop. So I think it's a combination of the two. Neeraj, I want to thank you for the time, the chance to share with you. If you agree with everything I've said, Neeraj and I have failed. We want to get you uncomfortable. We want to get you thinking. And it's usually a blended version of the topics that we covered. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
We covered a lot of topics today.
I'm
I'm going to give you one last chance. You know, any nugget you'd share with the 200 CEOs in the room any kind of one final thought, guidance you'd give to them as they continue on their journey?
Yeah, the minute I had my competitors was when I had them thinking on this quarter and this year, and it was game over. Even though the market does not reward you for this, and sometimes even the venture capital world does not, play your hand out where you want to be in 3 and 5 years and have the courage to balance to that. And tell your investors and your shareholders that's the game you're in. If you're playing it 1 quarter at a time or 1 year at a time, a good competitor is going to beat you. And I think that's an important thing where the market's going the opposite way. That's why, 52% of the number of public companies there were just a decade ago. And why people are waiting so long to go public is the public pressure of this quarter and this year is causing decisions to be made which may not be in the best interest of your company. So I'd make your decisions 3 to 5 years out. Secondly, culture, culture, culture. It will determine how good you are or not.
John, thank you so much for taking the time to share insights with the team.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.